Part 1. The Traffic Stop Doctor. James Robinson checked his watch for the third time as he drove through the empty streets. It was 2 in the morning and the city was fast asleep. But sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. His phone had rung 15 minutes ago with news that made his heart race. A patient was dying at County General Hospital, and he was the only surgeon who could save them. The roads were clear, almost too clear. James pressed down on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb. He knew he was going faster than he should, but every second counted. The traffic light ahead turned yellow. He had a choice to make: stop and waste precious time or push through. The hospital was only 10 minutes away. His training told him that his patient had maybe 20 minutes before things became critical. He made the decision and drove through just as the light turned red. That's when he saw them. Blue and red lights erupted behind him, painting the dark street in flashing colors. James felt his stomach drop. Not now, not tonight. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands already reaching for his wallet and hospital identification badge. His phone buzzed again. It was the hospital. He answered quickly. "Dr. Robinson, where are you? The patient is crashing. We need you now." The nurse's voice was tight with urgency. "I'm almost there. I got pulled over." "Give me 5 minutes," James said, trying to keep his voice calm even though panic was building in his chest. He watched in his rearview mirror as the officer stepped out of the patrol car. The walk seemed to take forever. Each second felt like an hour. Finally, the officer reached his window. James rolled it down immediately, putting on his most respectful face. "Good evening, officer. I know I was speeding. I'm a surgeon and I'm rushing to the hospital for an emergency. I have a patient who needs immediate surgery." James held up his hospital badge, hoping the officer would understand. Officer David Patterson looked at the badge, then at James, then back at the badge. His face showed nothing. No sympathy. No understanding. "Just cold assessment. License and registration," Patterson said flatly. James felt a chill run down his spine. Something in the officer's tone told him this wasn't going to be quick. He reached slowly into his glove compartment, making sure to announce every movement. "I'm reaching for my registration now," James said clearly. His father had taught him long ago how to act during traffic stops. "Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly. Don't make sudden movements." It was advice that had served him well over the years, though he hated that he needed it. He handed over his documents. Officer Patterson took them without a word and walked back to his patrol car. James watched him go, his frustration building. His phone rang again. "The hospital," he answered. "Doctor, we're losing him. His blood pressure is dropping fast." "How far are you?" The nurse sounded desperate now. "Tell the team to prep the OR, keep him stable." "I'll be there soon," James said, though he had no idea if that was true anymore. "Step out of the vehicle." Officer Patterson's voice cut through the phone conversation. James looked up, confused. The officer was standing at his window again, one hand resting on his belt near his weapon. James felt his mouth go dry. "Officer, please. I really need to get to the hospital. My patient is dying," James said, keeping his voice level despite the fear creeping up his throat. "Step out of the vehicle now," Patterson repeated, his voice harder this time. James ended the call and slowly opened his car door. He stepped out into the cool night air, his hands visible at his sides. Other cars were starting to pass by, slowing down to look at the scene. He saw phones raised, recording. In another situation, he might have been grateful for witnesses. Right now, he just felt humiliated. "Is there a problem with my license?" James asked. "I'm running your information. Just stay right here," Patterson said, studying James with suspicious eyes. "Can I show you my hospital credentials? I have letters, my medical license, anything you need to verify. Just please let me go. Someone is going to die if I don't get there," James pleaded. Patterson barely glanced at the additional documents James pulled from his wallet. These could be fake. Anyone can print an ID card these days. James felt anger flash through him, hot and sharp. Fake. He had spent 12 years in medical school and residency to earn those credentials. He had saved hundreds of lives. And now he was being treated like a criminal, while a real patient was bleeding out on an operating table. "Officer, please call the hospital. County General. Ask for the emergency room." "They'll confirm everything," James said, trying a different approach. "I'll decide what I need to confirm," Patterson replied coldly. The minutes dragged on. James watched the officer sitting in his patrol car, occasionally looking at his computer screen but mostly just waiting. Was this really about verifying his identity, or was this about something else? James had been black in America long enough to know the answer, but he pushed the thought away. He couldn't afford to be angry right now. He needed to stay calm, stay smart, get to the hospital. His phone buzzed with text messages. The surgical team. The ER director. Everyone asking where he was. His patient's wife had arrived at the hospital. She was asking for him, trusting that he would save her husband's life. And here he stood on the side of the road, powerless. "Your record is clean," Patterson finally said, walking back to James. "But you were being aggressive with me. Belligerent." James blinked in surprise. Belligerent? He had been nothing but respectful, even as his patient's life slipped away. "I wasn't trying to be aggressive, officer. I'm just worried about my patient," James said carefully. "I could arrest you for obstruction. For the attitude you're giving me right now," Patterson said, his hand moving toward his handcuffs. Time seemed to stop. James realized in that moment just how precarious his situation was, how easily this could go wrong, how little control he had despite his education, despite his profession, despite everything he had accomplished. "I apologize if I came across the wrong way, officer. That wasn't my intention. I'm just concerned about my patient. I'll accept whatever citation you need to give me. I just need to get to the hospital," James said, swallowing his pride. Patterson stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Then he pulled out his citation book and began writing. James watched him form each letter, each number with agonizing slowness. Finally, Patterson tore off the ticket and handed it to James. "Slow down next time, and fix that attitude," Patterson said. James took the ticket without looking at it and got back in his car. His hands were shaking as he started the engine. He didn't look back at the officer as he pulled away. He just drove, faster now than before, not caring if he got pulled over again. 15 minutes. The traffic stop had taken 15 minutes. 15 minutes that his patient didn't have. 15 minutes stolen by suspicion and prejudice disguised as procedure. As James raced toward the hospital, he had no idea that in just a few hours, fate would deal him the strangest hand of his career. The man who had just detained him, who had questioned his credentials and wasted precious time, would be fighting for his own life. And James would be the only one who could save him. Part 2. Racing against time. James burst through the emergency room doors like a hurricane. The automatic doors hadn't even fully opened before he was pushing through, his car keys still in his hand. The ER staff looked up, relief flooding their faces. "Where is he?" James called out, already moving toward the trauma bay. "Bay 3. Dr. Rodriguez has been keeping him stable, but barely. We've got 4 units of blood running and he's still dropping," the charge nurse said, falling into step beside him as they rushed down the hallway. James could hear the controlled chaos before he even entered the room. The steady beep of monitors, the urgent voices of medical staff, the hiss of oxygen. He pushed through the door and took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The patient was a man in his early 40s, a construction worker who had fallen 3 stories onto a piece of rebar. The impact had caused massive internal damage. His abdomen was distended, a clear sign of internal bleeding. His skin had that grayish pale color that meant he was running out of time. "Talk to me, Rodriguez," James said, scrubbing his hands at the sink without looking away from the patient. Dr. Linda Rodriguez, the resident on duty, rattled off the vitals. "Blood pressure is 80/50 and dropping. Heart rate is 130. We've got fluids wide open and he's had 6 units of blood so far. CT scan shows a ruptured spleen and possible liver damage. He's going to code if we don't get him to surgery in the next 5 minutes." James nodded, his mind already planning the surgery step by step. "Call the OR, tell them we're coming up now. I need a full surgical team, Stat. And someone call his family. Let them know we're doing everything we can." As the team prepared to move the patient, James finally looked at the man's face. He was unconscious, breathing with the help of a ventilator. He had a wife. 3 kids, according to the chart. He coached Little League on weekends. He was just a regular guy who had gone to work that morning not knowing it might be his last day. James felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This man's life was in his hands now. Every decision he made in the next few hours would determine if those 3 kids still had a father tomorrow. They wheeled the patient toward the elevator, moving fast but controlled. James walked alongside the gurney, his eyes never leaving the monitors. The blood pressure was still dropping. They were running out of time. In the elevator, surrounded by his team and the patient fighting for life, James felt his phone buzz. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. He pulled it out, intending to silence it, but saw it was the hospital administrator. "Dr. Robinson, I heard about the traffic stop," the text read. "The officer who pulled you over just filed an incident report saying you were hostile. Are you okay?" James stared at the message, anger flooding through him again. Hostile? He had been desperate to save a life, and now that officer was trying to cover himself by painting James as the problem. But he couldn't think about that now. He had a patient to save. The elevator doors opened to the surgical floor. The OR was ready, lights bright, instruments laid out with precision. James's surgical team was already there, gowned and gloved, waiting for him. "Let's move, people. We don't have time to waste," James said, his voice calm but commanding. He scrubbed in quickly, the ritual familiar and comforting. Soap water scrub brush, up to the elbows. Every surface clean. It was a routine he had done thousands of times, but it never lost its significance. These hands would hold a life. They needed to be clean. They needed to be steady. They needed to be ready. In the OR, James took his position at the table. The patient was draped, only his abdomen exposed. The anesthesiologist gave the okay. James picked up the scalpel. "Time is tissue, people. Let's save this man's life," he said, and made the first incision. What he found inside was worse than the CT scan had shown. The spleen was completely ruptured, blood pooling in the abdominal cavity. The liver had a deep laceration. There was damage to the small intestine as well. It was a mess, but James had trained for this. His hands moved with practiced precision, each movement deliberate and sure. He called out instructions to his team, and they responded like a well-oiled machine. Suction here, clamp there, more gauze, another unit of blood. Time seemed to both speed up and slow down in the OR. Minutes felt like hours, but also like seconds. James was completely focused, his entire world narrowed down to the few inches of tissue in front of him. The traffic stop, the officer, the frustration, all of it faded away. There was only the surgery, only the patient, only the work. He removed the damaged spleen. He repaired the liver laceration, his stitches small and precise. He checked the intestines, fixing the tears he found. He explored every inch of the abdominal cavity, making sure there was no more bleeding, no more damage. "How are his vitals?" James asked, not looking up from his work. "Blood pressure is coming up, 100/60. Heart rate is down to 90. He's stabilizing," the anesthesiologist reported. James allowed himself a small moment of relief. The patient was going to make it. Not out of the woods yet, but the worst was over. He began the careful process of closing layer by layer, intestines, muscle, fascia, skin, each stitch placed with care. 3 hours after he had made the first incision, James stepped back from the table. The surgery was complete. The patient's vitals were stable. He was alive. "Good work, everyone. Let's get him to the ICU. I want vitals every 15 minutes for the next 6 hours. Call me if anything changes," James said, pulling off his surgical gloves. The team began the process of preparing the patient for transfer. James walked out of the OR, exhausted but satisfied. He had done his job. Despite the delay, despite the frustration, despite everything, he had saved a life. He made his way to the surgical lounge, his body suddenly feeling the weight of the long night. He slumped into a chair and closed his eyes. His mind replayed the traffic stop. 15 minutes. 15 minutes that could have cost this patient his life. 15 minutes of being treated like a criminal instead of a doctor rushing to save someone. Should he file a complaint? The officer had wasted crucial time. He had been dismissive and hostile. He had even filed a false report claiming James was belligerent. But James knew how these things went. A black doctor's word against a white officer's. Even with his credentials, even with his position, he wasn't sure anyone would believe him. His phone buzzed again. Another text from the administrator. "We have dashcam footage from your car if you need it." The officer's behavior was completely unacceptable. James stared at the message. Maybe he did have a chance. Maybe this time there would be accountability. He started typing a response but stopped. He was too tired to deal with this now. It could wait until morning. He grabbed a cup of coffee from the machine, the bitter taste familiar and grounding. As he sat there in the quiet lounge, he had no idea that in just a few hours, he would face the most difficult decision of his career. The man who had detained him, who had questioned his credentials, who had made him feel like less than human, that man would be wheeled into his emergency room, bleeding and dying, and James would have to choose what kind of doctor, what kind of man he wanted to be. Part 3. The unexpected emergency. James had just closed his eyes when the alarm went off. Not the gentle buzz of a phone, but the sharp, piercing wail of a trauma alert. His eyes snapped open, his body responding before his mind fully registered what was happening. Years of training did that to you. Turned you into someone who could go from exhausted to alert in seconds. He was on his feet and moving toward the door when his pager went off. The message was short and urgent. Level 1 trauma incoming. GSW to abdomen. Officer down. ETA 2 minutes. Officer down. James felt a strange twist in his stomach. He had treated police officers before. It was always intense, always emotional. The entire hospital seemed to feel the weight differently when it was someone who wore a badge. He made his way back to the emergency room, gulping down the last of his coffee. The ER was already mobilizing. Trauma Bay 1 was being prepped. Nurses were pulling out equipment. The blood bank was being notified. Everyone moved with practiced efficiency, but there was an extra tension in the air. What do we know? James asked the charge nurse. Domestic disturbance call. The officer took a round to the abdomen. Paramedics said he's lost a lot of blood. They've got 2 large-bore IVs running and he's been intubated in the field. Vitals are unstable, she reported, pulling on fresh gloves. James nodded and started gowning up. Another life to save. Another family waiting for news. The job never stopped. He positioned himself at the head of the trauma bay, ready to receive the patient. Around him, his team took their positions. Everyone knew their role. The ambulance bay doors burst open. 2 paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney between them. James could see blood-soaked bandages, IV lines trailing, the rhythmic push of a bag valve mask providing oxygen. The paramedics were calling out vitals as they moved. BP is 70/40, heart rate 140. He's got a single GSW to the right upper quadrant. Massive blood loss at the scene. We've pushed 4 liters of fluid and he's still shocky. They transferred the patient to the trauma bay bed with practiced efficiency. James moved in immediately, his hands already assessing the wound while calling out orders. I need 2 more large-bore IVs. Call for O-negative blood, 6 units to start. Get me a chest x-ray and a fast exam. Someone call the OR and tell them we're coming up. His hands moved quickly, checking the airway, listening to breath sounds, palpating the abdomen. The wound was bad, very bad. The bullet had entered just below the rib cage on the right side. That meant possible liver damage, maybe intestinal perforation, definitely major blood loss. Who is he? James asked, not looking up from his examination. There was a strange pause. James glanced up and saw his team exchanging looks. The charge nurse stepped closer, her voice low. Dr. Robinson, it's Officer Patterson, the one who pulled you over tonight. James's hands froze. He looked down at the patient's face for the first time. The face was pale, streaked with sweat and blood, but it was him. Officer David Patterson, the man who had detained him, who had questioned his credentials, who had wasted 15 minutes while James's patient was dying, the man who had made him feel small and powerless just hours ago. James felt the world tilt slightly. His mind raced through a dozen emotions in the span of a heartbeat. Anger, satisfaction, fear, confusion. And underneath it all, a question that made his stomach turn. What kind of doctor am I about to become? Doctor? The nurse's voice cut through his thoughts. What do you want to do? James looked around the trauma bay. His team was watching him, some with concern, some with curiosity, all of them waiting for his decision. The patient's blood pressure was dropping. Every second he hesitated was a second closer to death. How far out is Dr. Chen? James asked, referring to the other trauma surgeon on call. At least 30 minutes. He's at home, the resident replied. 30 minutes. Patterson didn't have 30 minutes. Maybe not even 10. The blood pooling beneath him told that story clearly enough. If James walked away now, this man would die. There wasn't anyone else. There wasn't time to wait. James looked back at Patterson's face. Even unconscious, even dying, he still wore that expression of authority. James thought about the traffic stop, about the minutes stolen, about being treated like a suspect instead of a doctor, about the false report Patterson had filed. This man had seen him as less than human, and now his life was in James's hands. "Dr. Robinson, we need a decision," the anesthesiologist said urgently. The monitors were alarming. Patterson's heart rate was climbing while his blood pressure plummeted. He was circling the drain. James closed his eyes for just a second. He thought about why he had become a doctor. He remembered his first day of medical school, standing in a lecture hall with 100 other students, taking the Hippocratic Oath. "I will remember that I remain a member of society, with special obligations to all my fellow human beings." He thought about his father, who had taught him to survive traffic stops, but who had also taught him to be better than the hate directed at him. He thought about his mother, a nurse who had told him that healing hands should never be used as weapons, even when you had every right to be angry. And he thought about the patient from earlier tonight. The construction worker, the father of 3, the man who had survived because James had fought to get to him, because James had refused to give up, because James believed every life mattered. Every life. Even this one. James opened his eyes, his jaw set with determination. He stepped forward and placed his hands on Patterson's chest, feeling for the landmarks he needed. "Let's move him to the OR right now. Call for 6 more units of blood and have them keep it coming. Alert anesthesia. We're coming up with a critical patient. I need a full surgical team in 5 minutes," James commanded, his voice steady and strong. The team exploded into motion. Relief was visible on several faces. They began preparing Patterson for transport. Dr. Rodriguez, the resident, moved closer to James. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. James looked at her. "Am I sure I want to save a life?" "Yeah, I'm sure. Even after what he did to you tonight." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Especially after what he did to me tonight. Because I need to prove that I'm not what he thought I was. And maybe, just maybe, he needs to learn that the man he treated like a criminal is actually the man who's going to save his life." They wheeled Patterson toward the elevator. As they moved through the hallways, James saw the gathering crowd. Other police officers had arrived. Patterson's captain was there, his face grim. Nurses and doctors lined the halls, watching solemnly. Everyone knew what was happening. The gossip had spread fast. The officer who had stopped Dr. Robinson was now fighting for his life, with Dr. Robinson as his only hope. In the elevator, James looked down at Patterson. The man's face was slack, his skin gray. He looked so different from the confident, authoritative officer who had stood over James just hours ago. He looked human, vulnerable, mortal. "Stay with me," James said quietly. "I'm not going to let you die. Not tonight." The elevator doors opened to the surgical floor. The OR was ready. The lights were bright. The instruments were laid out. James's team was waiting. As he scrubbed in for the second time that night, James caught his reflection in the mirror. He looked tired. More than tired, exhausted. But his eyes were clear. His hands were steady. He knew what he had to do. He walked into the OR and took his position at the table. Patterson lay before him, draped and prepped. The anesthesiologist gave the signal. James picked up the scalpel. "Okay, everyone, listen up," James said to his team. "This is just another patient. Another life that needs saving. We're going to give him the same care, the same skill, the same dedication we give everyone who comes through these doors. Because that's what we do. That's who we are." He paused, looking around at his team. "Let's save this man's life." And with that, James made the first incision, choosing compassion over revenge, healing over hurt, and proving that the content of his character was so much more than the color of his skin. Part 4. Life on the Line. The moment James opened Patterson's abdomen, he knew this was going to be one of the most difficult surgeries of his career. Blood welled up from the incision, dark and thick. The bullet had done devastating damage, tearing through tissue with brutal efficiency. "Suction," James called out calmly. "I need to see what we're dealing with." The surgical nurse responded immediately, clearing the blood so James could visualize the damage. What he saw made his jaw tighten. The bullet had entered through the right upper quadrant and traveled through the liver, nicking the hepatic artery before tearing through the intestines. It was a nightmare scenario. "Talk to me, vitals," James said, his hands already working to control the bleeding. "BP is 60/40. Heart rate 150. He's barely holding on," the anesthesiologist reported. "We're pushing blood as fast as we can, but he's losing it faster than we can replace it." James nodded, his mind racing through the surgical steps he needed to take. Priority 1, stop the bleeding. Priority 2, repair the damaged organs. Priority 3, make sure there were no other injuries he was missing. Each step had to be perfect. One mistake and Patterson would die on this table. Clamp, James said, holding out his hand. The instrument was placed in his palm immediately. He carefully placed the clamp on the damaged section of the hepatic artery, stopping the worst of the bleeding. The blood flow slowed. The monitors began to stabilize slightly. BP coming up to 70/40, the anesthesiologist announced. Heart rate dropping to 130. Good. James allowed himself a moment of relief. Patterson had been seconds away from bleeding out completely. Now he had a fighting chance. But the surgery was far from over. As James worked, his mind kept drifting to the strangeness of the situation. Here he was, saving the life of a man who had treated him with contempt and suspicion just hours ago. His hands were literally inside this man's body, repairing the damage that could kill him. It was an intimacy that felt almost wrong given their history. But James pushed those thoughts away. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Every movement had to be precise. Every decision had to be correct. Patterson's life depended on it. Rodriguez, take the retractor. I need better exposure, James instructed the resident. As Rodriguez adjusted her position, James examined the liver damage more closely. The laceration was deep, spanning nearly 4 centimeters. He would need to use a special suturing technique to repair it without causing more damage to the delicate tissue. What's his blood count? James asked. Hemoglobin is 7 and dropping. We're running unit number 10, came the reply. 10 units of blood. Patterson had essentially lost his entire blood volume and then some. The fact that he was still alive was a testament to the speed of the response and the quality of the surgical team. But they still had a long way to go. James began the delicate process of repairing the liver. His stitches were small and precise, each one placed with careful consideration. Too tight and he would tear the tissue. Too loose and the bleeding would continue. It was a balance that required years of experience and an extremely steady hand. As he worked, he was aware of the weight of the moment. Outside this OR, Patterson's family was waiting. His fellow officers were pacing the halls. The hospital administrator was probably dealing with the press. This wasn't just another surgery. It was a statement, a test, a moment that would define how James was seen by everyone around him. Some people thought he was a hero for choosing to operate on Patterson despite their confrontation. Others probably thought he was a fool for helping someone who had treated him so poorly. James didn't care about either opinion. He was doing this because it was right, because his oath demanded it, because he refused to let prejudice turn him into someone he wasn't. The liver repair is holding, James announced after what felt like hours, but was only 30 minutes. Now let's look at the intestines. The damage there was extensive. The bullet had perforated the small intestine in 3 places. Each perforation needed to be repaired individually, the torn edges brought together and sutured closed. It was tedious work, requiring intense concentration. James's back was starting to ache from standing in one position. His eyes were tired from the bright lights and the intense focus. His hands were steady, but he could feel the fatigue creeping in. He had been awake for over 20 hours now, with 2 major surgeries back to back. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. How long have we been in here? James asked. 3 hours and 40 minutes, someone replied. 3 hours and 40 minutes. It felt like both longer and shorter than that. Time had a strange quality in the OR. You could lose yourself in the work. The steady rhythm of cutting and suturing, the constant communication with your team, the beeping of monitors providing a soundtrack to the surgery. Almost done, James said, more to himself than anyone else. Just need to close. But before he could begin closing, he needed to do a final check. He explored the entire abdominal cavity methodically, looking for any bleeding he might have missed, any damage he hadn't noticed. This was crucial. Missing something now could be fatal later. His hands moved through Patterson's abdomen with practiced efficiency. Liver repaired and not bleeding. Intestines, all perforations closed. Stomach intact. Spleen intact. Kidneys intact. Nothing else was damaged. The bullet had done its harm and nothing more. We're clear. Let's close him up, James announced. The tension in the room eased slightly. They had made it through the critical part. Now it was just the careful work of putting everything back together. James began suturing the layers of tissue, working from the inside out. Each layer had to be closed properly to prevent hernias or infections later. As he worked on the final layer of skin, James found himself thinking about what would happen after this surgery. Patterson would wake up eventually. He would learn that James had saved his life. How would he react? Would he feel grateful, ashamed? Would this change anything about how he saw the world? How he treated people? James didn't know. He couldn't control that. All he could control was his own actions, his own choices. And he had chosen to be a healer, not a punisher. He had chosen compassion over bitterness. He had chosen to be the bigger man. Last stitch, James said, tying off the final suture. He stepped back from the table and looked at his work. The incision was closed neatly. Patterson's vitals were stable. His color was better. He was going to survive. Good work, everyone, James said to his team. Let's get him to the ICU, full monitoring. I want to be called immediately if anything changes. As the team prepared Patterson for transport, James pulled off his surgical gloves and gown. He was exhausted. Every muscle in his body ached. His head was pounding. But he also felt something else, a sense of peace. He had done the right thing. Despite the anger, despite the hurt, despite having every reason to walk away, he had done the right thing. Dr. Rodriguez approached him as he scrubbed out. That was incredible, Dr. Robinson. The way you repaired that liver. I've never seen anything like it. James smiled tiredly. You learn to do the impossible when there's no other choice. He didn't have time for us to be anything less than perfect. Can I ask you something? Rodriguez said hesitantly. Sure. How did you do it? How did you push past what he did to you and just operate like none of it mattered? James was quiet for a moment, drying his hands slowly. Then he said, It did matter. It matters a lot. But when I took the Hippocratic Oath, I promised to treat every patient with the same care and respect. I didn't promise to only treat the ones who treat me well. I didn't promise to only help people who deserve it. I promised to heal. Period. He paused, looking through the OR window at Patterson being wheeled away. Besides, holding on to anger and using it as a weapon, that would make me just like him. And I refuse to become that. Rodriguez nodded slowly. I think I understand. Also, James added with a slight smile, imagine how he's going to feel when he wakes up and realizes the black surgeon he treated like a criminal just saved his life. That's going to be a much more powerful lesson than anything I could say or do out of spite. They walked out of the OR together. In the hallway, James saw Patterson's captain and several other officers waiting. They all turned to look at him as he emerged. The captain stepped forward. Dr. Robinson, how is he? James took a breath. The surgery went well. We repaired the damage to his liver and intestines. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable now. He's going to make it. The captain's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much, James nodded. He'll be in the ICU for a few days. He's got a long recovery ahead, but he should make a full recovery if there are no complications. Doctor, the captain said, then stopped. He seemed to be struggling with his words. I heard about what happened earlier tonight. The traffic stop. I want you to know that's not acceptable. That's not how we train our officers to behave. James met his eyes. I appreciate that. I really do. Patterson is a good officer, but he's got some things he needs to work on, some biases he needs to face. Maybe this will be a wake-up call for him, the captain said. Maybe, James agreed. People can change. I have to believe that. He excused himself and headed to the doctor's lounge. He collapsed onto the couch, every bone in his body feeling like lead. 2 surgeries, both successful. Part 5, The Awakening. 2 days had passed since the surgery. 2 days of James checking on Patterson's progress, reviewing his charts, adjusting his medications, all while carefully avoiding actually going into his room. It wasn't professional, James knew that. But every time he approached that ICU room, something held him back. Patterson was recovering well. The nurses reported good vital signs. No signs of infection. The breathing tube had been removed. He was slowly waking up. Everything was going according to plan. James told himself that was enough. He didn't need to have a face-to-face conversation with the man, but he knew he was being a coward. On the second evening, James finally forced himself to do his rounds in person. He had been standing outside Patterson's room for 5 minutes when the ICU nurse approached him. Dr. Robinson, he's been asking for you, she said gently. James felt his stomach tighten. What did he say? He asked who operated on him. When I told him it was you, he got very quiet. Then he asked if you would come talk to him. That was about an hour ago. James nodded slowly. There was no avoiding it anymore. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Patterson was sitting up slightly in the bed, his wife beside him holding his hand. He looked weak, pale, and much older than he had during the traffic stop. The tubes and wires connected to him made him look vulnerable in a way that was almost startling to James. Patterson's eyes met James's. For a long moment, neither man spoke. I'll give you two some privacy, Patterson's wife said quietly, squeezing her husband's hand before leaving the room. James moved to the foot of the bed, maintaining his professional distance. How are you feeling, Officer Patterson? Patterson's voice was rough from the breathing tube. Like I got shot. James couldn't help but smile slightly. That would be accurate. You gave us quite a scare in surgery. They told me you're the one who operated. That you saved my life, Patterson said, his eyes never leaving James's face. I'm a trauma surgeon. It's my job, James replied simply. Patterson shook his head slightly, wincing at the movement. No, it's more than that. I know what I did. How I treated you that night. James felt his jaw tighten. Let's not talk about that now. You need to focus on recovery. Please, Patterson said, and there was something raw in his voice. I need to say this. I've been lying here for 2 days thinking about it. About what kind of man I am. About what kind of man you are. James stayed quiet, his arms crossed over his chest. I pulled you over because you were speeding. That's true, Patterson continued. But if you had been a white doctor in a nice car, I probably would have let you go with a warning. I definitely wouldn't have made you get out of the vehicle. I wouldn't have questioned your credentials. I wouldn't have wasted 15 minutes of your time while your patient was dying. The words hung in the air between them. James had known all of this, of course, but hearing Patterson actually acknowledge it was different. I saw you and I made assumptions, Patterson said, his voice breaking slightly. I saw your skin color before I saw your profession. I saw you as a potential threat instead of a doctor trying to save a life. And that's on me. That's my failure, my bias, my racism. James was surprised by the bluntness of the confession. Most people danced around that word. They called it unconscious bias or implicit prejudice, but Patterson had just called it what it was. Racism. Why are you telling me this? James asked quietly. Because you deserve to hear it. Because I need to say it out loud, Patterson said. I've been a cop for 18 years. I always told myself I was one of the good ones. I never used excessive force. I never planted evidence. I treated people with respect. Or at least I thought I did. He paused, looking down at his hands. But these past 2 days, lying here, knowing that you saved my life after how I treated you, it's made me look at everything differently. How many other people have I stopped and treated with suspicion just because of how they looked? How many doctors, lawyers, teachers, fathers, mothers? How many people have I made feel less than human because of my assumptions? James moved closer to the bed, his professional demeanor softening slightly. Officer Patterson— David, please, call me David, Patterson interrupted. James nodded. David, I appreciate you saying all of this. I really do. But you need to understand something. I didn't save your life to teach you a lesson. I didn't do it to prove I'm a better person than you. I did it because it's my job. Because every life has value, including yours. Even after what I did to you? David asked. Especially after what you did to me, James replied. Because if I had let my anger or hurt dictate my actions, if I had walked away and let you die, then I would have been using the same kind of judgment you used on me. I would have been deciding your worth based on your actions just like you decided mine based on my appearance. David was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said, I filed a report. After the traffic stop. I said you were hostile and belligerent. I know, James said, it was a lie. You were professional the entire time, respectful, even though you had every right to be angry. I filed that report to cover myself in case you complained, David admitted. My captain found the dashcam footage from your car. He saw everything. The report is being withdrawn and there's going to be an internal investigation into my conduct. James nodded. Good. Not because I want to see you punished, but because that behavior shouldn't be acceptable for someone in your position. It's worse than an investigation, David continued. Word got out about what happened. About how I stopped you, about how you still saved my life. It's all over social media. The news is covering it. I'm either a villain or a cautionary tale depending on who's talking. How does that make you feel? James asked. David laughed bitterly, then winced as the movement pulled at his stitches. Ashamed, embarrassed, angry at myself. But also, strangely grateful? Is that weird? To be grateful for being called out? Not weird, James said. It means you're capable of growth. That's more than a lot of people can say. I have 2 daughters, David said suddenly. Teenagers. They're both upset with me. My oldest said she's embarrassed to tell her friends her dad is the racist cop from the news. That hurt more than getting shot, if I'm being honest. James sat down in the chair beside the bed. Kids have a way of cutting through our defenses, don't they? She's right to be embarrassed. I've been teaching them values I wasn't living up to myself, David said. I told them to judge people by their character, to treat everyone with respect, to look past surface differences. And then I turn around and do the exact opposite. So what are you going to do about it? James asked. David looked at him seriously. Change. Really change, not just say I'll change. I've already asked my captain about diversity training, real training, not just a one-day seminar. I want to understand my biases and work on them. I want to do better. That's a good start, James acknowledged, but it's not enough, is it? David said. Training can only do so much. This has to come from inside. I have to want to see people differently. To question my assumptions every single time. James nodded. That's the hard part. It's easy to say you'll change. It's much harder to actually do the work, to catch yourself in the moment and choose differently. They sat in silence for a moment. The monitors beeped steadily. Somewhere down the hall, a phone was ringing. The normal sounds of a hospital at night. Can I ask you something? David said finally. Sure. When they brought me in and you found out it was me, did you hesitate? Even for a second, did you think about not operating? James considered lying, giving the easy answer. But he respected David enough to tell the truth. Yes. For maybe 10 seconds, I thought about calling for the other surgeon. I thought about all the reasons I had to walk away. But you didn't. No, I didn't. Because I realized that if I let you die, I'd have to live with that for the rest of my life. And that version of me, the one who could let someone die because they hurt my feelings, that's not who I want to be, James explained. You're a better man than I am, David said quietly. I'm just a man who made a choice. The same choice is available to everyone, including you. Every day you wake up and decide what kind of person you're going to be, what kind of officer you're going to be. You can't change the past, David, but you can change the future. David nodded, wiping at his eyes. My wife told me something yesterday. She said maybe this happened for a reason. Maybe I needed to be saved by the man I wronged, to really understand the weight of my actions. I don't know if I believe in fate or divine intervention or whatever, but I know this. I'm not going to waste this second chance. Good, James said, standing up. Because you have a lot of work ahead of you. Physical therapy, recovery, rebuilding trust with your community, teaching your daughters that people can grow and change. That's a full schedule, David smiled slightly. Thanks, Dr. Robinson, for everything. James, you can call me James. As James walked toward the door, David called out, James? One more thing, James turned back. I'm sorry. I'm truly deeply sorry for how I treated you, for the assumptions I made, for the time I wasted, for making you feel less than what you are. You're an incredible surgeon and an even better human being. I'm sorry I couldn't see that immediately. James felt something loosen in his chest, an anger he hadn't fully acknowledged he was carrying. Part 6. Healing beyond the physical 3 weeks had passed since David Patterson left the hospital. 3 weeks of physical therapy, of learning to move without pain, of slowly rebuilding his strength. But more than that, 3 weeks of reflection, of difficult conversations, and of confronting truths he had spent his entire career avoiding. James hadn't seen David since he was discharged. Their paths hadn't crossed, and James had been fine with that. He had done his job as a surgeon. The rest was up to David. But then he received an unexpected phone call from the police captain. Dr. Robinson, this is Captain Williams from the precinct. I know this is unusual, but we're organizing a community town hall on police reform and accountability. Officer Patterson specifically requested that you be there. He wants to speak publicly about what happened between you two. James was silent for a moment. Why me? Because your story matters. Because what happened between you and Patterson is happening every day across this country. but usually without the resolution you two found. People need to see that change is possible, that accountability and forgiveness can coexist. James wasn't sure he wanted to be a symbol or a teaching moment, but he also understood the power of storytelling. If sharing his experience could help even one person see things differently, maybe it was worth it. When is it? James asked. Next Tuesday evening at the community center. Will you come? James agreed, though he spent the next several days regretting it. He wasn't a public speaker. He was a surgeon. He was comfortable with scalpels, not microphones. But Tuesday came anyway, as days tend to do. The community center was packed. James arrived early and stood in the back, watching people file in. He saw David arrive with his wife and daughters. David walked with a slight limp still, his hand unconsciously touching his abdomen where the bullet had entered. When their eyes met across the room, David gave him a small nod. James nodded back. The town hall began with Captain Williams explaining the purpose of the gathering: to discuss police practices, to listen to community concerns, to work toward better relationships between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. It all sounded good in theory, but James knew the reality was much more complicated. Several community members spoke. Some shared stories of positive interactions with police. Others shared stories of profiling, harassment, and fear. Each story painted a picture of a community divided, of trust broken, of a system that worked for some but not for others. Then it was David's turn to speak. David walked to the microphone slowly, his movements still careful. He looked out at the crowd, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but heavy with emotion. My name is David Patterson. I've been a police officer for 18 years. And for most of those 18 years, I thought I was one of the good guys. I thought I was fair. I thought I treated everyone equally. He paused, looking down at his notes, then back up at the crowd. 3 weeks ago, I learned how wrong I was. David told the story of the traffic stop. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't make excuses. He described in detail how he had profiled James, how he had wasted critical time, how he had filed a false report. The room was silent as people listened. And then, David continued, a few hours after I made Dr. James Robinson feel like a criminal, I was shot. I was brought to the same hospital where Dr. Robinson works, and despite everything I had done to him, despite having every reason to walk away, he saved my life. David's voice cracked slightly. He spent over 4 hours in surgery putting me back together. And he did it not because I deserved it, but because he's a doctor who believes every life has value, even mine. James watched from the back of the room as David spoke. He saw the raw honesty in David's face, the genuine remorse. This wasn't a performance. This was a man truly reckoning with himself. I can't change what I did that night, David said. I can't give Dr. Robinson back those 15 minutes I stole. I can't undo the humiliation, the anger, the frustration I caused. But what I can do is stand here and tell you the truth. The truth is that I had biases I refused to acknowledge. The truth is that my actions that night weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern of assumptions I've been making my entire career. The truth is that I'm part of the problem. The audience stirred. Some people nodded. Others looked skeptical. Change was hard to believe in when you'd been disappointed so many times before. But here's the other truth, David continued. People can change. I'm committed to changing, not just taking a class and checking a box, but really doing the hard work of examining my biases, challenging my assumptions, and being better. And if I can change, if someone like me who was so set in his ways can learn and grow, then there's hope for all of us. David looked directly at James. Dr. Robinson, would you come up here? Please? James felt his heart rate pick up. This wasn't part of the plan, but he saw Captain Williams nodding encouragingly, and he saw David's daughters looking at him with hopeful expressions. He made his way to the front of the room. Standing beside David at the microphone, James could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. He had faced life and death decisions in the operating room without breaking a sweat, but this was different. This felt more vulnerable somehow. I didn't want to come tonight, James admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. I didn't want to share this story. I didn't want to be a symbol or a lesson or a feel-good story about forgiveness and redemption. The room was absolutely silent now. But I'm here because I realized something important. What happened between David and me, it's not unique. It's not special. It happens every single day in this country. Black doctors, black lawyers, black teachers, black parents. We all have stories of being profiled, of being treated as threats before being seen as human beings. James took a breath. The only thing that makes my story different is that I had the power to save David's life. I had leverage. I had a choice. And I chose to heal instead of harm. But most people who are profiled don't get that kind of closure. They don't get apologies. They don't get accountability. They just get to live with the anger and the hurt and the knowledge that to some people, they'll never be seen as fully human. He turned to look at David. I appreciate David's apology. I appreciate his willingness to do the work of changing. I really do. But one officer changing isn't enough. We need systemic change. We need policies that prevent profiling. We need accountability when officers abuse their power. We need training that goes beyond checking boxes. We need to fundamentally rethink what policing looks like in our communities. James looked back at the audience. I'm a surgeon. I fix bodies. But what we need is to fix the system that keeps creating these injuries in the first place. We need to address the disease, not just treat the symptoms. The room erupted in applause. James hadn't expected that. He had expected resistance, defensiveness, pushback. But instead, people were standing, clapping, nodding in agreement. When the applause died down, an older woman in the front row raised her hand. Dr. Robinson, how did you find it in yourself to forgive? My son was profiled and arrested for no reason. They never apologized. I don't know if I can forgive that. James thought carefully before responding. I don't think forgiveness is about letting people off the hook. It's not about saying what happened is okay. For me, forgiving David was about refusing to let his actions turn me into someone bitter and angry. It was about protecting my own peace. He paused. But here's the thing. I could only forgive David because he did the work. He acknowledged what he did. He took responsibility. He's committed to changing. Forgiveness without accountability is just enabling. So if the people who hurt your son never acknowledge the harm they caused, if they never take responsibility, if they never change, you have every right to withhold forgiveness. Your peace doesn't require you to make excuses for people who hurt you. Another hand went up. This time it was a young black man, maybe in his early 20s. I want to believe people can change. I really do. But I've been stopped by cops probably 20 times in my life. Never got an apology. Never saw any consequences. Why should I believe this time is different? David stepped forward to answer. You shouldn't. You shouldn't believe me just because I'm standing here saying pretty words. Belief has to be earned. So here's what I'm doing. I'm working with the department to revise our training protocols. I'm meeting regularly with community leaders to understand their concerns. I'm being vocal in my department when I see other officers engaging in the same behaviors I'm guilty of. And I'm going to keep doing that work whether anyone believes in me or not, because it's the right thing to do. The young man nodded slowly, his expression still skeptical but slightly softened. The town hall continued for another hour. People shared stories, asked questions, challenged both James and David. It was uncomfortable at times, tense at others, but it was real. It was honest, and that felt like progress. As people began to leave, David's older daughter approached James. She looked nervous but determined. Dr. Robinson, I'm Katie, David's daughter. I just wanted to say thank you, not just for saving my dad's life, but for being willing to forgive him. It's meant everything to our family. James smiled gently at her. Your dad's the one doing the hard work, Katie. Part 7. The ripple effect. 6 months had passed since that night in the emergency room. 6 months of healing, growing and discovering just how far one moment of compassion could reach. James was learning that saving David Patterson's life had been just the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. The first surprise came when James was invited to speak at a medical conference. The topic? Ethics, bias, and the duty to treat. Standing before an audience of hundreds of doctors, nurses, and medical students, James shared his story. He talked about the anger he felt, the choice he faced, and the oath that guided his decision. After his speech, a young medical student approached him with tears in her eyes. Dr. Robinson, I needed to hear that. I'm one of only 3 black students in my class. Last month, one of my professors made a comment about how I only got in because of affirmative action. I've been so angry, so hurt. Your story reminded me why I wanted to become a doctor in the first place. To heal, not to hate. That conversation stayed with James. He realized that his story wasn't just about him and David anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced discrimination and had to choose how to respond. It was about maintaining your humanity in the face of inhumanity. David, meanwhile, was on his own journey. He had returned to work, but in a different capacity. The department had created a new position, Community Liaison Officer. David's job was to build bridges between the police and the neighborhoods they served. It meant going to community meetings, listening to concerns, and being the face of change within the department. It wasn't easy. Many people didn't trust him. Some saw him as a token, a PR move to make the department look good without real change. Others saw him as a traitor to his fellow officers who didn't appreciate him speaking openly about police bias. But David kept showing up. He went to block parties and barbecues. He visited schools and talked to kids about accountability and respect. He sat in church basements and listened to mothers share their fears about their sons encountering police. Slowly, grudgingly, people began to see that his commitment was real. One afternoon, David called James. "Can we meet for coffee? There's something I want to run by you." They met at a small cafe halfway between the hospital and the police station. It was the first time they had gotten together socially, and there was an initial awkwardness as they settled into their seats. "How's the recovery going?" James asked. "Good. Still can't do everything I used to, but I'm getting there," David said, unconsciously touching his abdomen. "How about you? I saw the video of your conference speech. Pretty powerful stuff, thanks." It felt strange at first, sharing something so personal with strangers, but I think it's important, James replied. David nodded, stirring his coffee. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. I've been approached by several organizations wanting me to speak about my experience. Police reform groups, diversity training companies, even some schools. They want me to share my story and talk about transformation and accountability." "That's great," James said. "You should do it. That's the thing, though. It doesn't feel right doing it without you. Our story isn't just my redemption arc. It's about the choice you made, the grace you showed. I don't want to tell half the story," David explained. James was quiet for a moment. "You want us to speak together? I think we'd have more impact that way. My story of waking up and recognizing my bias is important, but your story of choosing compassion over revenge, that's the part that really changes people. At least that's what I've seen in the feedback from the town hall." James considered it. He had already committed to speaking at the medical conference. But traveling around with David, telling their story over and over, that was different. That was a much bigger commitment. "I'll think about it," James said finally. Over the next few weeks, James did think about it. He talked to his wife, his colleagues, his friends. Everyone had opinions. Some thought it was a great opportunity to create change. Others worried he was being used, that David was using his story for redemption without James getting anything in return. But then something happened that made the decision for him. A young surgeon at the hospital. Dr. Taylor Singh came to James's office one day. Taylor was Indian American, brilliant, and one of the rising stars in the department. But that day he looked shaken. "Dr. Robinson, can I talk to you about something?" James waved him in. "Of course. What's going on?" Taylor sat down heavily. "I was stopped by police last night. I was driving home from the hospital after a late surgery. They said my taillight was out, but then they asked me to step out of the car. They searched my vehicle. They questioned where I was going, where I had been. The whole thing took 40 minutes. James felt his stomach tighten with familiar anger. "Did they give you a ticket?" "No, they just let me go eventually. But Dr. Robinson, I was terrified the entire time. I kept thinking about your story, about how you stayed calm, how you survived that interaction. I tried to do the same, but I was shaking. I couldn't think straight." Taylor looked up and James saw tears in the younger doctor's eyes. "I've worked so hard to get here. Medical school, residency, fellowship. I save lives. I'm good at what I do. But in that moment, none of that mattered. I was just another brown man in a car who looked suspicious to them." James moved around his desk and sat beside Taylor. "I'm sorry that happened to you. I wish I could say it was rare, but we both know it's not. How do you deal with it? The anger? The frustration? How do you not let it destroy you?" Taylor asked. James thought about the question carefully. "I don't know if I have a good answer. Some days I'm better at it than others. But I think the key is finding ways to channel that anger into something constructive. For me, that's been telling my story, trying to create understanding, working toward change. Do you think change is really possible? Or are we just fooling ourselves? Taylor's voice was bitter. I think change is possible, James said firmly. I've seen it. David Patterson was a man who profiled people without even realizing it. Now he's actively working to make the system better. If he can change, others can too. That conversation stayed with James. He realized that staying silent, keeping his story private, wasn't protecting him. It was just letting the cycle continue. If sharing what happened to him could help even one person, could prevent even one unjust traffic stop, then he had an obligation to speak up. He called David that evening. I'm in. Let's do the speaking tour together. And so they did. Over the next several months, James and David spoke at police academies, churches, community centers, and universities. They shared their story, answered difficult questions, and challenged people to examine their own biases. The reactions were mixed. Some audiences were receptive and grateful. Others were hostile and defensive. But slowly they began to see the impact. Police departments started implementing new training based on their recommendations. Officers began speaking up when they saw colleagues engaging in profiling. Community members started attending more town halls and demanding accountability. And individual people, doctors like Taylor, young students, parents worried about their children, reached out to share how the story had affected them, how it had given them hope, how it had inspired them to believe in the possibility of change. One evening, after a particularly tough speaking engagement where they faced a lot of pushback, David and James sat in a hotel lobby exhausted. Do you ever wonder if we're making a difference? David asked. Some days it feels like we're just talking to walls. James smiled tiredly. Every single day. But then I remember that conversation with Taylor, or that medical student at the conference, or the emails we get from people saying our story changed how they see the world. We might not be changing everyone, but we're changing someone, and that someone might change someone else. That's how ripples work, David nodded. Ripples. I like that. We threw a stone in the water and now we're watching it spread. The thing about ripples, James said, is that you never know how far they'll reach. We might never see the full impact of what we're doing, but that doesn't mean the impact isn't real. What they didn't know was that their story had already reached further than they imagined. A documentary filmmaker had been following their journey, creating a film about their unlikely friendship and the conversations they were sparking. The film would eventually be shown at a major festival, reaching millions of people. A novelist had been inspired to write a book exploring themes of bias, forgiveness, and redemption based loosely on their experience. It would become a bestseller and required reading in many high schools, and countless individuals, people they would never meet, in towns they would never visit, were having different conversations with their families, their friends, their communities because of the example James and David had set. But even without knowing all of this, sitting in that hotel lobby, both men felt the weight and the importance of what they were doing. They had taken a moment of pain and prejudice and transformed it into a catalyst for change. You know what the hardest part is for me? David said after a long silence. What's that? Knowing that I can never undo the harm I caused. Not just to you, but to all the other people I profiled over the years. People whose names I don't even remember. Part 8, full circle 1 year. 365 days since that night when blue and red lights flashed in James's rearview mirror. 365 days since he stood in an operating room, holding the life of his adversary in his hands. The anniversary arrived quietly, but it carried weight. James was finishing his morning rounds when his phone buzzed with a text from David. Coffee today? Same place? I have something to show you. An hour later, they sat at their usual corner table at the cafe that had become their meeting spot. David pulled out his phone and opened an email. I got this yesterday, David said, sliding the phone across the table. James read the email. It was from a young officer in another state, someone who had attended one of their speaking events 3 months ago. The officer wrote about how their story had changed his entire approach to policing, how he had caught himself making assumptions about a driver he pulled over and consciously chose to see the person differently, how that simple choice had led to a positive interaction instead of a confrontation. He's not the only one. David continued, pulling out more emails on his tablet. I've been collecting these. Officers, community members, students, people whose lives were touched by what we shared. I wanted you to see the impact we're having. James scrolled through message after message. A mother thanking them for helping her son understand that not all police officers were the enemy. A police chief crediting their story for helping his department implement better training. A college student who changed her major to criminal justice reform after hearing them speak. "This is incredible," James said softly. "It gets better," David said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "The police academy in the state capitol wants to make our story part of their mandatory training curriculum. Not just a one-time speech, but an actual case study that every new officer will learn from." James looked up in surprise. "Seriously?" "Dead serious. They're developing a whole module around bias, accountability, and the duty to serve. Our story is the centerpiece. They want us to help design the training and come in once a quarter to speak to new recruits." James leaned back in his chair, processing this information. When he had made the decision to operate on David that night, he never imagined it would lead here. To systematic change. To training that could affect thousands of officers. "There's more," David said, looking almost nervous now. "The city council has approved funding for a new community policing initiative. They're calling it the Second Chances program. The idea is to pair officers who have made mistakes with community members who have been harmed by police actions. It's based entirely on what happened between us." "That's amazing, David," James said, genuinely moved. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," David said. "Your willingness to forgive, to work with me, to believe that change was possible, that's what made all of this happen." James shook his head. "We did this together. Your willingness to be accountable, to face your mistakes, to do the real work of changing, that's just as important." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee and watching people pass by the window. The cafe was full of regular folks going about their day, unaware that they were sitting near two men whose story had traveled around the world. "Can I tell you something?" David said after a while. "Something I haven't told anyone else? Of course, I still have nightmares sometimes. Not about being shot, I mean I have those too, but about the traffic stop. In my dreams I see myself pulling you over, but this time I see it from your perspective. I feel what you must have felt. The frustration, the anger, the fear, and I wake up feeling sick." David's voice was thick with emotion. "I think about all the other traffic stops I've done over the years. All the times I made snap judgments. All the people I made feel the way I made you feel. And I wonder how many of them have nightmares about me." James reached across the table and gripped David's shoulder. "The fact that you think about this, that it haunts you, that's proof that you've changed. The old you wouldn't have cared. Wouldn't have lost sleep over it. I want to make it right somehow, with all of them. But I can't. I don't even know who most of them are," David said. "So you make it right by being different moving forward, by teaching other officers, by changing the system so fewer people have to experience what they did. That's how you honor them," James replied. David nodded, wiping his eyes. "I'm going back to school, by the way, getting my master's degree in social work. I want to understand community dynamics better, understand trauma, understand how to build real trust." "That's fantastic," James said, meaning it. "My daughters are proud of me again," David added with a small smile. "Katie wants to be a social worker now too. She says she wants to help bridge divides the way she's seen me try to do. That meant more to me than any award or recognition." James smiled. "Kids have a way of keeping us honest. What about you? What's next for Dr. James Robinson?" David asked. James had been thinking about that a lot lately. "I've been approached about writing a book, about the experience, about medical ethics, about choosing compassion in difficult moments. I'm considering it." "You should do it," David encouraged. "Your perspective is important. The world needs to hear it." "Maybe," James said. "I'm also thinking about starting a program at the hospital, training medical students on how to handle difficult ethical situations, how to treat patients even when you're angry with them, how to maintain your humanity in a system that often feels dehumanizing." "That sounds perfect for you," David said. James's phone buzzed. It was the hospital. He glanced at the message and smiled. "Remember the construction worker? The patient I was rushing to save the night you pulled me over?" "Of course." "Did he make it?" "He made a full recovery. That's him texting me now. He wants to meet for lunch next week. Says he wants to thank me in person and hear the full story of that night," James explained. "Will you tell him?" David asked. "About the traffic stop? About how those 15 minutes almost cost him his life?" James was quiet for a moment. "I think I have to." Not to make you look bad, but because it's part of the story, and because he deserves to know how close it was. I'd like to meet him too, if that's okay, David said. I'd like to apologize to him. He's another person harmed by my actions that night. James nodded. I'll ask him. They finished their coffee and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The street was busy with lunchtime traffic, people hurrying to and from restaurants, delivery drivers making their rounds, life happening in all its messy, complicated glory. You know what I think about sometimes? James said as they walked toward their cars. I think about all the small moments that led to that night. If I had left the hospital 5 minutes earlier or later, I wouldn't have been at that intersection when the light turned yellow. If you had been patrolling a different route, you wouldn't have seen me. If the gunman had been in a different neighborhood, you wouldn't have responded to that call. Butterfly effect, David said. All these tiny choices creating this massive outcome. Exactly. Makes you realize how connected we all are. How one moment, one decision, can ripple out and affect so many lives, James reflected. They reached their cars parked side by side. Before getting in, David extended his hand. James shook it, and then they pulled each other into a brief hug. Same time next week? David asked. Wouldn't miss it, James replied. As James drove back to the hospital, he reflected on the journey of the past year. From anger to forgiveness, from pain to purpose, from enemies to friends. It hadn't been easy. There were still hard days, still moments when the old anger surfaced, still times when David said something that revealed a blind spot he was still working on. But they kept showing up. They kept doing the work. They kept choosing to see each other's humanity even when it was difficult. That evening, James was called to the ER for another trauma. Another life hanging in the balance. As he scrubbed in and prepared to operate, he thought about his oath. About the promise he had made to heal, to do no harm, to treat every patient with dignity and respect. He thought about how close he had come to breaking that oath. How tempting it had been to walk away from David and let someone else handle it. How satisfying it would have felt in that moment to let his anger win. But he hadn't. And because he hadn't, everything had changed. The surgery went well. Another life saved. Another family that would get to keep their loved one. As James peeled off his surgical gloves and headed to give the family the good news, he felt that familiar sense of purpose that had drawn him to medicine in the first place. This was who he was. A healer. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. Not because people always deserved it, but because every life had value. Not because he was perfect, but because he was committed to trying. Later that night, before going to sleep, James checked his email one more time. There was a message from the medical student he had spoken to at the conference. She was writing to tell him she had just completed her first successful solo surgery, and she had thought of his words as she scrubbed in, "Heal, don't hate." James smiled and closed his laptop. The ripples continued. The change continued. The work continued. And somewhere across town, David was also checking his messages. An email from a young officer,